So, when you're introduced to somebody that you don't know, what is the first thing that you generally do? Right? Or, you probably ask them their name. Maybe you tell them your name, right? Or, let's say you're at church or work or a social event or something like that. And you're with a friend and you see someone and you ask, who is that person? What will they normally say? They'll say, oh, that's, so-and-so, whoever it might be. Maybe they'll say a few, highlights of like where they work or how they're related or what you know about them or something like that. But, at that point, when you learn somebody's name, do you really know them? Even if you maybe learn a few things about them, do you really work? Do you really know them? As I said, you might learn where they work. You might learn maybe some activities that they like to do. You might learn about their family, but you still don't really know them, do you? You wouldn't claim to know them per se. But then what happens as you get to know somebody better? It's not that you forget their name, of course, but it becomes not quite so important, right? Because you know something about that person. You know more about their character. You know more about how they act, how they respond, what they talk about, how they say things, right? You get to know that person better. And as I say, you still know their name, but that's not necessarily even, the most important thing that you think about that person. And especially as you get to know somebody longer and longer, there can be surprises. You get to, sometimes learn something new. I'll pick on Mrs. Luker. I got to learn a little side of her humor that I would not have guessed a few weeks ago. And I've known her for many years now. But, as you get to know somebody, you get to know them better. You get to know more about them, different aspects of them. And, when we look at the Bible, it has pretty similar perspective, right? If we turn to Matthew 7:15, we'll go there, and I'll say I'm reordering my sermon on the fly, so we'll see how it works. But if you go to Matthew 7:15, what does Christ say? He says here, he's talking about false prophets, but he says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them what? You will know them by their fruits." You won't necessarily know them by their name. You won't be able to immediately identify them as soon as you meet them for the first time. But how are you going to get to know them? In this case, it's talking about false prophets. But it goes on and it says, "Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit." And of course, what are those fruits? What are the good fruits? Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, the fruits of the Spirit, right? And what are those bad fruits? We know those as well: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, and it goes on. You start to know and you start to learn about that person by their actions, and then what's produced from those actions, from their words and what's produced from those words, their thoughts and what are produced. And it goes on and it says in Matthew 7:18, "A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." Right? And that's how we get to know people. We get to know them over time by what they do, by what they say, how the things that they do affect other people, how it affects you. Right? And if you turn to John 13:34, we see this again. Because what does Christ say in relation to his disciples? How will we know Christ's disciples? He doesn't say we'll know Christ's disciples by the fact that they go to a church with a particular name, right? He doesn't say you'll know his disciples because they can say my name in the proper way, right? What does it say? John 13:34. It's talking about here, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another." by this, right? It's not by the name of the church that they go to, or it's not that they can know that, or that they know the proper name of God. It says, by this, being love, all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Again, Christ here is saying, you get to really know somebody by their actions, by their words, by their deeds, and how those interact with other people, what fruits that they produce. But, and then if you think about history, right? If you have a favorite person from history, or maybe even a celebrity, how do you get to know that person? Maybe you're not able to interact with them on a daily basis, but what do you do? If you have a favorite, historical figure, what do you likely do? You go and read any kind of book that you can about that person. You read anything that they might have written. You learn as much as you can. Kind of one of my historical favorite people growing up was Davy Crockett. He was, I was at least raised in Tennessee, and Davy Crockett was a very, very famous Tennessean, and I loved Davy Crockett. I had an outfit that looked like him, or at least, I hoped it looked like him. I read books. I have one of the first books that I got of him, and it's well worn. The seam is coming off, or the spine is coming off, and the pages have been flipped through, and it's not all together. But I probably read that one book, 100 times when I was young. And even now, every new book that comes out on Davy Crockett, since I was young, I've picked up that book almost as soon as it come out and read about it, right? And, I read his writings that he had done. I learned about things that he'd done when he was in Congress. I like to watch The Alamo. That was one of my favorite movies when I was younger, or the Davy Crockett movies from Disney. But I spent a lot of time trying to learn about him, read everything that I could. Another example, I don't listen to much radio, but I listen to one particular segment fairly often, and it's given by the president of Hillsdale College. And an interesting thing about him is he was on the kind of official biography of Winston Churchill. And he had, when he was younger, he had spent an enormous amount of time going through basically all of the information that they have about Winston Churchill, in particular his own writings and writings of close friends and all of these kind of things, to prepare these volumes. And I think it's 24 or 25 volumes of official biography on him. But it's interesting to hear him talk, because when he talks, and he's on this radio show with a host, and the host will ask him a question, and he'll say like, "Oh, what would Churchill have thought about this or that?" And almost every time, what he says is he starts giving a story. Well, one time Winston Churchill, and then he'll go on about the story, because he knows so much. But one of the things that he knows, or one of the things that he's kind of learned in teaching about Churchill or talking about Churchill, is the best way to get to know about Winston Churchill is to read all the stories and to tell stories about him. Because you don't just say, Churchill was brave. What he does is he says, well, there was a time when he was in a war in Africa, and he was actually a reporter at the time, and the train got attacked, and he, even as a reporter, he led the men into battle. Well, this was the kind of courage that he had. He had no reason he had to. The soldiers around him were there to protect him. But the type of man he was, the courage that he had, the physical courage was such that he wouldn't stand idly by when there was other people in danger. And this is, of course, one of the great ways that we get to learn about people. And even when we learn about each other, right? We don't get to spend all our lives with everybody all the time, but we can get to know people by the stories that are told about them, right? My grandfather, I was blessed that I was probably about, I think, 18 or so when he died. So I knew a little bit about him. I engaged a lot about him, but I didn't know about him when he was younger, right? Of course, I was not even born yet, but I know that he was a man who who had, was very athletic. He played minor league baseball even, and he was always one of the fastest men whenever, and they lived way out in the country, and so it'd be the kind where they would have rural, county fairs and that kind of stuff, and then they'd have races, and he would always win these races as a young man. And so the way that I got to know more about him was by the stories that were told. But what about knowing God? How can we use what we're given in the Bible to better know God, to truly know God? So today, I want to begin at the beginning of the Bible. So if you'll turn to the beginning of the Bible, we'll start there. And if you're turning to Genesis 1:1, you're turning into the wrong place, because where I want to start, or what I'm going to claim sort of is the beginning of the Bible, is Exodus 3. So if you'll turn to Exodus 3, and you might ask why I claim this is the beginning of the Bible. The bad joke would be, well, in today's society, you can claim everything or anything and just say that that's it. That's not the reason. I'm saying that this is the beginning of the Bible because this is the chapter of the burning bush. And we know about the burning bush, right? Because this is the first time Moses, the writer of the Bible, interacted with God. Think about that. A whole book and several chapters in, but the first real interaction Moses had, the thing that would shape everything that he would go on to write in the Bible, was actually Exodus 3, right? This is when he encounters God for the first time. And of course, as Moses starts to write the Bible as we know it, God kind of fills in the backstory of everything that had happened or everything that he wanted Moses to write down before Exodus 3. But Exodus 3 is actually where the Bible began, or where Moses, as the author, his interactions with God began. And everything after that was colored by what happened here in Exodus 3. So if you'll pick up in verse 4, it says in verse 4, so when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him, and this, Moses was out with his sheep as a shepherd, and he saw a bush that was burning but not being consumed. And so here in Exodus 3, verse 4, it says, so when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, of course, I think all of us, if we saw a bush that was on fire but just kind of stayed on fire without it burning up the bush, we would take notice. But it says, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And then he said, do not draw near this place, take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is on holy ground. Now, if I was Moses, I think I'd be pretty startled. What is this bush that knows my name? It knows at least my name. But then it goes on and says, moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now here, when God first starts to speak to Moses, he uses the word Elohim, which is the Hebrew word 430 for God. But when he uses this, he's not actually telling Moses his name. He's more telling him what line of work he's in, right? Because this Elohim is not specific to a single God. So anyone that claimed to be a god would use this word Elohim. It would be similar to saying like, I'm the lawyer for Sam, Mary and Bob. God is just saying I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not claiming anything personal or unique, but just that he was that God for his fathers. But then it goes on, and here in Exodus 3, then God goes on and he tells Moses that he's seen the oppression of the Israelites, and he intends to deliver them and to bring the Israelites to the promised land that he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then Moses, basically is told that he's going to be sent to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And they kind of go back and forth because at first Moses doesn't really want this task. I'm not sure, he's telling God, I'm not sure that I'm up to the task. But then God reassures him and says that, I'll be with you. And then Moses asks that very common first question when you meet somebody. Because again, remember, this is the first time that Moses is meeting God. Here in Exodus 3:13, so dropping down to Exodus 3:13, it says, "Then Moses said to God, 'Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers have sent me.'" Again, remember this word God is just a generic title. It's not something specific. "And they say to me, what is his name?" Right? Because if someone comes to you and says, "I'm going to deliver you and I have this God who's backing me," you're going to want to know the name of the God. Right? And all the gods at the time, all the little g gods at the time had names. And those names were, related to the things that they had power over. So they were, in some ways limited gods, but at least they, thought that they had power over this thing or another thing, death or life or birth or growth or, whatever it may be. But he goes on and he says, "And they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" Now, I can only imagine Moses was probably a little curious himself, but he used this, "Well, you're sending me to these other people, so what name should I tell them?" And then in verse 14, it says, "And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent you." Right? So here's the first time that God is telling his name, or at least the first time that's recorded that God is telling his name to a human being. And it goes on and it says, "Moreover, God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord." And here, this is the Lord here is, of course, Yahweh. And when you look at the Hebrew of these different terms that God uses for himself, "I am who I am," and then "I am," and then Yahweh, they're all fairly related. They're a little slightly different variations, and I won't go to all the background, but they're all fairly related, and they all mean roughly the same thing, just different variants. And so basically, God is now telling Moses what his name is. It says, "The Lord God of your fathers," and then goes on, "the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And so he's saying, my name is Yahweh, and I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, again, these gods are the little gods, but he's putting that connection together. He's saying the same God who promised all of these great things to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the very God who's standing in front of you, and my name is the Lord, or Yahweh. And of course, this is a very powerful declaration, both of God's name and also some key information about God. Right? So imagine you're talking to another person, and it's very similar, right? You ask them their name, and then you get some basic information about them. Because this information is things like, he's self-existent. I am who I am. I'm the one who always was. And when you look at the Hebrew here, and I believe the Bible reading program that we had a while ago talks about this in detail. The translation is a little bit less about the past and more about the kind of being both the past, present, and future. And so, while all the English doesn't flow very well, it's kind of I be, or who I be, or something like that. And so he's basically saying, I'm someone who's always existed, I'm existing now, and I will always exist. And so here we learn this key information about God, that he is this omnipresent, always present being who was not created, right? That there was no creation in him. And while this is important information, it doesn't really tell you who God is, right? You don't know God at this point, or Moses didn't know God. Right? He had some interesting information about God, but what if this, omnipresent God, this God who was self-existent, who had always existed, what if this God ended up being a vicious God? What if this God ended up being a God who would just change his mind on a whim? Right? You don't know anything about God, or Moses didn't know anything about God at this point. I'm sure he knew a little bit about God because he knew that he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he hadn't seen God in action, so to speak. And as I said, it's interesting because at this point, God had actually not revealed his name to Abraham. So, or this particular name. So we see in Exodus 6:2 and 3, it says, this is a little bit later, and it says, and God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. He said, when I talked to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I actually didn't tell them my name. I was God Almighty to them. Right? But by my name, Lord, I was not known to them. So think about this point, because I think it's a little subtle here because it's so spread out. But if you think about it, that while Abraham didn't know God's name, God still called Abraham a friend. Right? Would you think that you were friends to someone if you didn't know their name? When Tina and I got married, one of the ways we used to decide who all we would invite was if they knew what CJ stood for, right? That they, not just knew what people called me, but my actual name. But here, what God is saying is he had a friend in Abraham who didn't even know his name. So did Abraham not know him? He didn't know his name. But Abraham, of course, knew him very well, knew him as a close personal friend, right? And so, as I say, it's a subtle point here, but it's interesting because what God is saying is that even though Abraham didn't know his real name, Abraham knew God on the level that was most important. He knew God's character. He knew how God acted. He knew the fruits that God produced. Right? It's as I say, it might be a subtle point because it's so spread out in the Bible, but it's very important because what God is saying here is he said, my name is important. He's not saying his name is not important, but he's saying it's not as important as the fruits that I produce, as the things that I do. And of course, this is what Moses and the Israelites were about to find out, right? Think of, over the next, let's say year or so, the kind of many months during the book of Exodus, they get a very close-up view of knowing God. They know God through his actions. They know God through his deeds. They know him through the words that they hear him speak. They see how he responds to them. Right? Think of all of the engagements that the Israelites and Moses had with God over over the next 40 years, but really those that period during the book of Exodus, we get to see a view of how much they learned about God in that relatively short period. Now, going into it, they knew his name, right? Moses, probably the very first thing he went and told him was, I am who I am. Yahweh or Jehovah has sent me to help free you from the Egyptians. So they, probably one of the first things they learned about God was his name. But even at that point, they didn't know him, right? They learned much deeper who God was. Because think about what they learned. They saw him, what? They saw him go through the 10 plagues. And they saw details about the 10 plagues, how they were affected by some and then weren't affected by some. How he put very strict rules, you could say, on the Passover if they wanted to be exempt. That they weren't just going to be exempt because, they were seeds of Abraham. That they had to follow his instructions. They had to do exactly what he said. They saw how he interacted with Pharaoh. How he came down hard on Pharaoh. Right? How he, led them to a point where they were stuck, that only a miracle could get them out. With the Red Sea on one hand and the army of pharaohs on the other hand and mountains on the sides. But they saw God do that and then miraculously deliver them. Right? They saw these things. They saw how they would complain to God about something, and then what would God do? He would deliver it. They would complain about not having water, and then what would he do? He would make water happen. putting a tree in one, one lake or one body of water, hitting a rock and having water come out of another. But they saw like that he would respond to them, that they would ask, not even in the nicest way, but he would deliver, right? He would deliver manna to them when they asked for food. When they asked for meat, he would deliver quail. And sometimes they got in trouble. They remember the story of the quail that they ate so much that they got sick. So that, he would respond in a way that if they didn't do the right thing, they would, get harmed. And then they saw how he responded to them as they sinned, right? And so we see time and time again over, I say that the span of the Exodus, that they learned about God. They started to know God. They started to know what his actions would be, how he would respond, what he said. And here, near the end of the Exodus, we'll turn to Exodus 34. This is kind of well through the Exodus. So things like they had done the covenant agreement. They were at Mount Sinai. The giving of the 10 Commandments had happened. Moses had been gone for that first 40 days and 40 nights. And the Israelites had made the golden calf. Moses had come down, at the command of God, and had, as part of that, had broken the two tablets of the 10 Commandments. And then God commands Moses, make 2 more tablets and come up. But then we see something here in Exodus 34, verse 5. It says, "Now the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord." Now, didn't they know the name of the Lord? Right? They had been given the name of the Lord already. But this is an interesting passage, you can say, about knowing God and how important, both his name is and how he uses his name to help us better understand God. Because here in Exodus 34, verse 6, it says, "And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed," right? So he's proclaiming his name. It says, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. Now this is quite a mouthful for a name, right? I'm not sure that we would want to repeat it every time we talk to God, but especially in that culture, this is what, kings and others would do. They would have all of these titles that would describe them. And normally what it would be is it would be a description of the lands that they were over, right? But here, God is doing something different. Because what God is saying is, if you really want to know me, if you really want to understand who I am, you have to understand my character, my characteristics. And we see here, because if you think about it, this is the first time that God is proclaiming these powerful statements about his character, about how much he's willing to work with sinful man, right? Because look at what it says. He's merciful. He's long-suffering. He's abounding in goodness and truth, and this, and forgiveness of iniquity, transgression, and sin. And think about what God is saying here. God is saying that to really know my name, to really know me, you have to understand what my character is like. But it's interesting because, again, he does this towards the end of Exodus. And what had the children of Israel already seen over that period of time? This was several months that they had been, that God had been very present in their lives. They had seen his mercy. They had seen his graciousness. They had seen his long suffering. They had seen that he was abounding in goodness and truth, that he was forgiving their sins, forgiving their iniquities. Right? They had seen all of this. They knew this. And it was only after they had seen this that he then proclaims to them that this is part of what's needed to really understand him. He doesn't start at the very beginning with his name and all his characteristics, right? He started with his name, And then he let him see what his characteristics were. And then he proclaimed them clearly that, yes, these are vital part of me. And that if you want to know me, you have to understand that this is what I'm like. So here, God is saying that it's, part of his very name is his character. That if you want to know him, you have to understand his character. And again, as I say, the culture there is a little bit different the culture back then was different than our culture now, because there, your name was not only just your identifier, but it would tell people a lot about you, right? Because in your name would be your family, and people would know who your family were and the characteristics of the family. And the expectation is, you were going to be a lot like your parents, that things didn't change much generation after generation. And so here, where God says my name, and then he goes on with these long list of characteristics, he's saying, this is how you should understand me. This is how you should know me. That is not just enough to know that I'm an eternal being. You have to know my character to understand who I really am. And we see that this is a fairly common pattern where God will kind of reveal a new part of his name. Because, and I won't go into great details, but I'll give some examples, and I'm sure we're all familiar that God goes by many names, and especially one of the things that he does is he compounds names together, right? So in this case, he'll use his name, Yahweh or Jehovah, and then he'll compound it with another characteristic or another description of his characteristic. And here he does it in a very long way and tells a lot of his characteristics, but he does it in other places. You don't have to turn to these, but you can jot them down. The first one is in Genesis 22, 13, and 14. And it's interesting here because, God had told Moses that he hadn't told Abraham what his name was, that he hadn't revealed his name as Yahweh, but Yahweh's used a few times in Genesis, and this is one of those. And so again, if you think back to the beginning of the Bible, so to speak, being Exodus 3, it had a powerful effect on Moses because Moses knew who his name was. And so as he's writing, even though it wasn't exactly how God had related it to Abraham, this is how Moses wrote it down. And so this first one is Yahweh Jireh, and it means Yahweh will provide. And this is, of course, when Abraham was offering up Isaac as a sacrifice. We read in Genesis 22, 7 and 8, it says that Isaac said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering." Right? And then as we read on, what does God do? God provided a ram. At the time when Abraham and Isaac are talking, Abraham didn't know how it was going to work out. I'm sure at that time, Abraham fully thought he was going to have to sacrifice his son. But he still knew that God would provide a way out. Now, he didn't know exactly how that would be. I'm sure he might have had thoughts or guesses, but he didn't know what it would be. But here, Moses is saying one of the things that Yahweh, that God will do, is he will provide. Right? And we see that characteristic throughout the Bible. He provides us what we need. It's a common theme. He provides us what we need when we need it in the exact way that we need it. Now, it might not be the way we want it. It might be kind of not exactly how we want it to go, but God is there providing exactly what we need. Another example, this is Yahweh Rophika, and it means Yahweh that heals. This is Exodus 15, verse 26. Again, we find this is a compound name used to talk about the account of healing of the waters at Merah, and this is Exodus kind of 15, 22 through 26. And here it says in Exodus 15, 26, and it says, "And said, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and keep all of his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." right? And so we find another characteristic about God, that he's a God who will heal you. And of course here, it's talking primarily physically, but we know, throughout the Bible that God promises to heal us not just physically, but spiritually and mentally. He promises to heal us completely. And again, that healing won't come always exactly when we want it. It won't come immediately. But what God does promise is it will happen in the time that he deems best. Sometimes it might have to wait, till the time when you're resurrected, right? That's what he had told Paul. He said, I'm not going to heal you in this life. But Paul is going to be made perfect when he's resurrected. Another example, Yahweh Nishi, and this is Yahweh, my banner. Now, this is in Exodus 17, verse 15. But the story around this is we see a battle with the Amalekites. And here, if you remember, this is the battle where Moses had to hold up the rod. And if he didn't hold up the rod, the Israelites would be defeated, or would start to be defeated. And then he would hold up the rod and they would start to win. And he had to have help in holding up his arms. But here, after the battle, right, after they had seen what God would do, and again, this is the common pattern, right? They would see God do something, and then God would say, that's part of my name. Here it says in Exodus 17:15, so after they had the victory, it says, and Moses built an altar and called his name, the Lord is my banner, right? Indicating that God will fight our battles for us, right? Because at that time, your banner or your standard would be the thing that would lead your troops into battle, right? It would be at the very front. And so what it's saying here is that, God will fight your battles. God will be in the front fighting your battles for you. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have no part in it, right? The banner is in the front. That doesn't mean it's the whole army. Right? You have to be there. You have to fight as well. But what it's saying is God will lead you into battle. God will be there in the very front of the battle. And so again, we see there's this pattern of reading a story, and then out of that story, we learning more about God, and then God applying it to his name. Another one, this is from Judges 6:24, Yahweh Shalom, Yahweh gives peace, right? This is, if the story is in Judges 6:21, this is when Gideon is essentially talked to by an angel of the God, or angel of Yahweh, and basically to commemorate that event and that he hadn't died in talking to this messenger of God, that he calls the place Yahweh Shalom. And we'll read a few verses here. It says in Exodus 6:21, it's, then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And then the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Right? He was pretty worried. He was scared what would happen. And then the Lord said to him, peace be with you. Do not fear. You shall not die. Right? Gideon thought he was going to die. He thought he had come face to face with an angel, and that because of that, he would die. And so Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day, it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. And so we see here, God will bring you peace, or God will give you peace. And of course, this is then a common theme that we see throughout the Bible. But again, this pattern of God doing something and then having it declared as part of his name. And of course, these stories where God, does something and has it kind of added to his name is just part of what we can learn about God, right? Because the whole Old Testament is filled with stories where we can learn about God. We can see what he says. We can see how he acts. We can see how he reacts to what's happening. Right? We can learn so much about our God in reading through these stories, right? They're not just dusty old stories that give us some history, right? That maybe some enjoyment, right? It's actually there for us to know our God. It's there for us to read through, pick through, and see what God is like. Recall back to when I was talking about how much I enjoy Davy Crockett. I would read those stories to learn about him. Yes, I enjoyed those stories. Yes, they were good history, but that's not why I read those stories. I read those stories because I wanted to know about him. In a lot of ways, I wanted to be like him. I wanted to, imagine that I was his friend, right? Or that I was just like him, that I would, become a great hunter that he was, being able to, with very few bullets, be able to feed whole communities over the winter. And this is what we can do with the Bible, right? It's full of stories, but these stories are there for a purpose. These stories are there to help us understand, to really know our God, right? Not just to know his name, but to know our God. Because think about all the stories and what we can learn, right? Think about Noah and the flood, right? We know that God, from that, both won't tolerate sin, but he'll also not be defeated by Satan in providing a path forward for mankind to ultimately be redeemed, right? Think. It's just the story of Noah and the flood, but it's very important. Or think about the story of Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah. What can we learn from that? Again, it's just a story. But we can learn that we can reason with God, that we can talk to God. But we have to do it based off of his ways. It can't be our will, it can't be our ways, but it has to be his ways. But if we do it his ways, he's willing to talk to us. He's willing to engage. He's willing to change his mind. Think how powerful that is. Because what you can think is, here's an all-powerful God that's just going to do what he wants. But we read stories about Abraham, about Moses, about others that are able to interact with God, reason with God. Now, again, it can't be based off of our will. It can't be based off of ways that are out of alignment with God. But you can go to God with his own reason, with his own logic, and say, have you thought about it from this perspective? And he's willing to change. That's pretty powerful to learn about our God and how we interact with him. What about the story of Gideon and the selection of the 300 men, right? He was going into a battle, and God said, no, too many men. And then when he finally selected the men, what were the men he selected? The ones that were the worst soldiers, right? They were like, oh yeah, maybe a sneak attack will come. I don't care. I'll just put my head down and get a drink of water as fast as possible. These would be the men you would say, okay, that is not a good soldier. But those were the 300 men God selected. Again, it's just a story, but what can we learn about our God from that story? We can learn that he's a God of clarity, right? He wants us to be very clear that even when he uses us, it's not us that wins the battle. They had so few men and they were the wrong men, and yet they won the battle because it was God who was the banner, who was leading them, right? And he wanted it to be very clear that he was the deliverer. What about Gideon and the wool fleece? I'm picking all over Gideon today, I guess. But what about Gideon and the wool fleece? Yeah, it's a funny story, right? Fleece, wet, not wet, make it, get water out of it, not water out of it. But what can we learn about our God? How can we know him more? We can learn that he's very patient with us. That even when we don't have faith in him, he has faith in us. And then he's willing to build our faith. He's willing to do the things that are needed to build our faith. Right? That's what we can read from the story of Gideon. Or what about Esther? Right? We see with Esther. What about Esther? We see that God plans way ahead, that he puts people in the places that they need to be so that his plan will work out. What's the likelihood of a Jewish girl marrying the king? Very small. Very small. I mean, how many things had to line up to make that happen? Yet God made it happen. And when you look at the beginning of the story, I'm sure no one knew why it happened. But when you look at the end of the story, you know exactly why it happened. And so you can see that about God, that God puts people in places not necessarily for right now and not necessarily for reasons that we can understand, but he puts them there for his bigger purpose. And there's others. We could spend all day. We could go, verse by verse through the Bible, and we can learn about our God this way. And this theme about knowing God based off of what he does is not just an Old Testament concept, right? Even though there's a lot of stories in the Old Testament. But it's interesting because when you think about it, we as a society and kind of for many centuries and going back probably all the way to the Greeks. So kind of Christ was right there at the period in between. But we are very intellectual. We want to read not a story. We want to read, like, give me the bullet points of what the highlights are, which is good. It's great for learning head knowledge, right? But it's not necessarily the best for learning deeply certain things, right? I gave the example of the president of Hillsdale College. He could go and talk about, Winston Churchill was, courageous, and he was very smart, and he was able to write a lot of books, and all of this kind of stuff, very kind of bullet points. But when he talks about him, he doesn't talk about him in that way. He gets that message across, but he does it through a story or through multiple stories. And so you can understand more deeply what he means, because there's different types of courage. But when you listen to the stories, you hear exactly the nuances that are trying to be gotten across. And so, as I say, when you look at the Bible, it's interesting because the intellectual part of the Bible is actually fairly small. Right? It's mainly the letters of the apostles, which is, as I say, it's kind of in between this time where the culture before the Greeks was very story-based. Right? This is why we have the parables. This is why things are taught as stories for most of the Bible. And then you see this shift where it's more the Greek way of thinking, more the bullet points. And this is, particularly Paul is like this, right? Because he was an intellectual, and so that's how he thought. But most of the Bible is really just stories, right? And if you think about it, most of the Bible is basically stories of Christ, either as God of the Old Testament or Jesus Christ, who was born as a man, how he interacted with mankind. This is basically what the Bible is. But in those stories, we can learn an incredible amount about Christ. And we can learn even more, because we'll see here, if you'll turn to John 14, verse 5, it's not just about Christ that we learn when we read these stories, when we deeply understand what God and Christ are trying to get across in all of these stories that they give us. Here in John 14, verse 5, Thomas says to him, being Christ, "Lord, we do not know where you are going, and how can we know the way?" Jesus said to him, "I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Oop. This is what I got in trouble for skipping around. There. Okay. And this is John 14, verse 7. It says, John 14, verse 7, Christ then says, "If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him." And then here goes in verse 8, Philip said to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us." Right? He still says, I don't know the Father. Right? And Jesus in verse 9 said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does not work, or does the work." What did the apostles know about Christ? They knew his name, yes, right? They knew, and it told a lot, right? It told he was the Messiah. An important fact. But what did they really know about Christ? What do we really know about Christ from the Gospels? We know things like he fed the 5,000, right? He taught them, and he didn't want them to go hungry. He cared about their physical needs. We know that he raised people from the dead, right? That he would teach in parables. We know that he would heal the sick, that he would heal the demon-possessed. He would go and have dinner with sinners, right? He was jealous for God's house, right? We know he went and cleaned out the temple because he was jealous for his Father's house. We know that he would speak out against the Pharisees and Sadducees, the leaders of the day, when they were leading the Jews astray. Right? We know these because we can read a series of stories. The apostles knew these things about him because they interacted with him and they lived with him for 3.5 years. They knew him deeply. Now, yes, they had head knowledge about what he said, but the things that they really knew about him was the experience they had with him. And we can get a glimpse of that by reading the Gospels. And what are the Gospels? They're basically a set of stories about Christ. Right? There's definitely doctrine there. There's intellectual knowledge there. But it's mainly a set of stories about Christ. And this is how we can learn deeply about who Christ is. Right? Again, God knew, knew how we learn people best. He could have just, a bunch of bullet points. I'm sure mankind did not invent bullet points. So if God had wanted to, he could have made the Bible a series of very clear bullet points for us to learn. But he didn't do it. He wrote all of these stories, or he had inspired people to write these stories so that we could learn about how he, what his acts are, how he does things, how he reacts, what the fruits are that he produces. Right? And as I said, the Gospels are full of these stories about how Christ acted and what he did in this, primarily 3.5 years. And the Old Testament is full of stories of how Christ, as the God of the Old Testament, acted, did, what he did, how he reacted, what he did in certain circumstances. And so here, he's basically telling the apostles, you know the Old Testament. You've seen me for 3.5 years at least. You know the Father because you see how I am. You see how I act. You see how I respond. You see the fruits that I produce. You see all the things that I've done, because that's how you're going to know the Father. Right? I don't need to tell you about the Father. Right? I don't need to tell you, kind of this bullet point list of things about the Father. No, you know him because you've seen how I am. Right? And that is what they've given us as well in the Bible. They've given us this ability to read these stories, to understand more deeply about them, to learn about them. And of course, we see God, of course, in our own lives, right? But think about it more as your grandparent, that you can see how they interact in your life, but to really know them, right? The whole thing about them, you have to understand their past, right? You have to understand why they interact with you the way that they do. You have to understand the whole detail, and this is not the whole details about God, of course, but it's the things that he has highlighted for us, and he's highlighted them essentially as a set of stories for us to go and read. And then, if that was not enough, what else do we know about God? We know the future, right? We know the future stories about God. A little less detailed than the past, less detailed than the present, but we know the future stories about God. We know where God is headed, where God is taking us. And so, brethren, we must be on a path to know our God, right? God expects us to know him. Again, think back to Abraham. Abraham did not know the name of God, but he knew God so much that he was friends with God. Again, he didn't know God's name, but he knew God so much that he was his friend. And so it's not just enough to know the name of God. Even the names that some of the long names that he adds on, right? All the details and descriptions, those still aren't enough, because even as he gave those, he would give the story of why or to essentially prove why what he was about to say was true. And so, we have to know his name, not the way that Moses knew God when God declared, I am who I am, right? And, a powerful thing to be sure in Moses' life. But at that point, Moses didn't know God, right? Moses knew God through the years that he saw God interact with him. He knew God through having written the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Even the backstory that he didn't know when God had first came to him. So brethren, as we think about going down this path of knowing God, it's so important because, he's our Father. We should desire to learn about him. And the way that we learn about him is by reading the Bible. And reading it not just as a set of stories, things to entertain us, but in a way that we are trying to learn who God is, trying to know God on a deeper level. So brethren, as we think about this, and as we're kind of in this time in between the holy days, I just encourage you, spend time in the Bible. Spend time reading these stories about your Father, God the Father, so that you can know him the way that he wants you to know him.